Welcome to this month's Curious and Quirky, the podcast that unpacks innovation, pokes at conventional wisdom, and fully supports your decision to start this year by listening to something smarter. This isn't your grandpa's podcast, though if he was anything like today's innovators, he'd already have a New Year's resolution to break at least three outdated rules. Now, each month we bring together the brilliant, bold, and slightly rebellious minds from Caltech's Executive Education to explore what leaders mostly get right and what happens when the resolution doesn't survive past January 16th. We'll ask the big why, challenge any safe answers anyone wants to bring to the table, and help you rethink the goals you might have set, the habits you've kept, and maybe the ones you quietly abandon mid-month. So grab your coffee or your New Year, New Me beverage of choice, or whatever fuels your optimism, because this is one resolution worth keeping. So let's get curious and maybe just a little bit quirky. So before we get started, we want to have a short conversation around some ideas that we've been having and some thoughts that I wanted to get from the panelists here. And then we'll get into the normal scheduling, scheduled programming. Lately I've been noticing a pattern with, senior leaders across my company, across the industry, et cetera. It seems that people aren't necessarily short on, I'll say, ambition or intelligence, right? Everyone has enough in the tank to get to where they need to go. But a lot of times they're so overwhelmed with everything that's happening, all the tools that are being thrown at them, all the technology that keeps evolving. They're short on what I'm calling clarity. AI, supply chains, innovation, digital transformation, change management, all these things, they don't live in isolation anymore. So a deep-rooted technical expert in these areas can only make it so far since there's so many complexities and interaction in the world today. And these leaders are now being asked to make decisions across all of these technical domains all at once. And so what's interesting is that the challenge that we're facing isn't necessarily learning, let's say, just another technology, that the AI is the next big thing. So it's not just learning AI per se. I think it's all about developing the judgment to ask better questions across all the disciplines, whether it's strategy, operations, change, technology, what have you, without really having to be the expert in the room. And that's the ultimate goal for any sort of leader in an organization, is to not necessarily force yourself to be an expert, but to surround yourself with people that you can ask the right questions for and come up with a better solution. So we have some of the folks here in the room. I wanted to kind of get your perspectives and quick thoughts here on what's one thing that senior leaders consistently underestimate when dealing with new technology or these advanced technologies. And we have this new course that is actually coming up here in the next month or so, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. But what can this new course that you guys are going to be involved in, how can that help them change that outcome? So start off with Tom, get your thoughts.
The race for adopting new technology is real. You've got to get there before your competitors do. But what happens in that race is one big thing, one big question that the executive can ask is, what does this new technology mean for the customer experience, the value proposition that we offer to customers? And that's the thing that can get lost. We can embrace something like AI and things like chatbots or things that that cut our operational times in half and increase operational excellence. But what's the impact to customers? And I think our involvement with the course asks that question, right? We end up in the course you're talking about, Tim. We go late in the week. And people have been thinking really creatively all week about new technologies. And in the middle of that creativity, we ask these questions and bring diagnostics so people can say, whatever we've learned and however that might impact the way we do business, how is that going to impact the customer experience and our value proposition?
Got it. Okay, thanks. Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm kicking this course off, and the reason they're having me do that is because I'm going to give a whole bunch of tools. And for the last 30 years, I've been pioneering ideation process, right? Relevant to technology, but two categories of this you might think of: those ideation processes that can help a company grow, new products, et cetera, new social media ideas, but also those that can make a company much more efficient, right? And improve processes. And so for the last 30 years, I've been trying to get organizations to use these tools to help them get more and better ideas. that's step one. Step two is, okay, now you got the ideas. How do you innovate these? And it turns out that the ideation processes will work for those as well, because those are just problems to be solved. Well, now with AI, it's so incredible that you can now trigger these techniques and processes to get more and better ideas faster and more efficiently. So I'm going to talk about which techniques to use for what kind of technology challenges and how to apply them against these two categories of opportunity, and not only to generate ideas, but to innovate those ideas successfully. And so, this could be a week course just by me,
Yeah.
but they're not going to let me do that. I only have a half day, but I'm going to give enough tools so that people will have those tools. They can use them for the rest of the week.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and think you're a great person to kick this thing off. You bring the energy to the table as well. So, all right. See, Jenny, are you involved in this course, the change management course? Uh, okay. Alan, talk about your supply chain.
Yeah, so to me, what's very interesting about the adoption of technology is that you go from the as is state without the new technology to the to be with the new technology. And the challenge isn't really the technology, it's the transition to it.
Right. Okay.
And the problem that I see, and this gets repeated over and over again, is a failure to invest in the appropriate amount of parallel training as one's implementing those new technologies. And with AI, the real challenge with AI, for example, is that we don't really know when we look at things that people write, we don't know if they're actually writing them. And there's a kind of a logic that says maybe we don't need to learn how to write anymore because AI can help do a lot, especially generative AI can help do a lot of the creative work for us. But then if we don't have that skill set, then how do we know when to apply quality assurance to the outputs that come out of, say, a tool like AI? And so that deep logical understanding, that deep critical thinking, that technical, organizational, cultural, behavioral sort of understandings are really important, and that requires additional training. In other words, if you're going to spend $1 million on implementing a tool like AI, probably ought to plan to spend about $1 million on training as well.
Okay. Perfect. Thanks, Alan, for that. So this exact attention, right? This is what you're hearing from the instructors, and you're hearing across, and you're feeling it across the organization and the industry. Really is, how leaders build judgment across all of these. They're chasing all these different trends, et cetera. Is something that this course is meant to support. It's not really a how-to course. It's not going to give you specific prompts to put in AI, et cetera. Like as Alan mentioned, it's going to help you kind of think more strategically and a little bit more innovatively about how to actually approach a problem or approach a situation, how to think differently, and helps you step back, connect those dots, and make those better decisions in these very complex environments. And so that's what I wanted to touch on briefly today. If you're interested in the course, reach back out to either the Caltech Executive Education team. Course is coming up here in February 21st through the 27th. It's going to be in person here in Southern California. So by all means, if you're interested, take a look. It's the Deep Tech course offered by CTME. Okay, on with our regular scheduled programming. It's January, which means we've all set, I'll say, somewhat bold resolutions and potentially built some ambitious plans for ourselves for the year. And we've already discovered at least one of them might have been wildly optimistic, which makes this the perfect time to talk about strategy, and the kind that survives past January 16th. Now, Tom Spitale is a partner at the Impact Planning Group, co-author of The Accidental Marketer, and a longtime instructor with Caltech Executive Education. He spent decades helping leaders turn fuzzy intentions into clear direction and avoiding the corporate version of "I'll start again next Monday." Tom does specialize in helping both accidental and seasoned marketers sharpen their thinking and align strategy with reality. So whether your resolution was to think more strategically or stop chasing shiny objects, this one's for you. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom Spitale.
Thank you, Tim. I want to talk about why smart companies misread signals in their markets. And I want to start with something that on the surface looked like a threat to many businesses, especially in the food industry. Now, over the last couple of years, drugs like Ozempic have exploded in popularity. They suppress appetite. So a lot of people, very smart people in those industries, looked at that trend and immediately concluded this is bad news for restaurants. Smaller appetites must mean fewer restaurant visits, right? Fewer restaurant visits must mean lower revenue. End of story. And when companies perceive a threat, their instinct is often to contract. So some restaurants have responded by cutting staff, trimming service, pulling back, which of course creates the familiar death spiral of business, right? A declining customer experience, fewer repeat visits, less and less traffic, and eventually a business that slowly starves itself. Except that's not what had to happen. Here's what the data actually showed. Households with at least one Ozempic user were spending more on dining out, not less. They were just behaving differently, ordering smaller portions, sharing meals, valuing flexibility. The restaurants that struggled treated Ozempic purely as a threat to their business model, and they retreated. The restaurants that adapted, they did something subtle but important. They didn't just ask, how do we protect ourselves? They also asked, where might this create opportunity? Those smart restaurants didn't panic. They tested smaller portions, flexible pricing. You see a lot of commercials for the protein forward options, which is necessary on Ozempic. Same customers, same need to eat, but a different behavior. That gap between noticing a trend and deciding how to respond is where strategy either happens or fails. And most organizations go straight from trend to reaction. The winners insert at a very important and subtle insight stage in between. In our work, that insight stage usually follows this simple discipline. First, spot the trend. Second, examine the impact on key stakeholders, especially customers. Third, force yourself to frame the trend in two ways. Yes, what if this is a threat? But what if this is an opportunity? And then, only then do you act, sometimes with a contingency plan, sometimes with a pilot program, sometimes by deliberately not changing anything. Let me give you another example. Years ago, a large bookstore chain noticed an odd trend in their stores. People were spending a long time there. From an operational standpoint, it looked like a problem. Long dwell times usually signal confusion or friction. And many retailers would have reacted to this data by trying to speed people up. Hey, let's have fewer titles. Let's have clearer signage. Let's have faster checkout. But this particular company paused and did the insight work. They asked how this problem actually showed up in their customers' lives. And what they discovered was simple and profound. For book lovers, shopping for books wasn't a task. It was entertainment. If they had treated online retail purely as a threat and optimized their bookstores for efficiency, they would have sterilized the entire experience and likely accelerated their own decline. Instead, they explored the opportunity side of the trend. They added chairs, couches, coffee. They made lingering the point. Of course, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's Barnes & Noble. And that insight, treating time spent as value, not friction, is a big reason they were one of the very few bookstores chains to weather the Amazon storm. Same trend that a lot of bookstores reacted to differently, but different interpretation, very different outcome. So let me end with a B2B example. A client of ours in the medical imaging business, specifically CT scanners, learned that certain breeds of dogs were being trained to detect cancer by sniffing a patient's breath. You can imagine the reaction. They said, wait, a dog that can diagnose cancer? What happens to our six-figure machines? This particular team kind of locked into the threat and they totally stalled. They never really examined what this trend meant for patients. But another company added that insight step in the middle. Armed with the same information, they followed the discipline and asked, how does this trend affect customer needs and how? And their insight was subtle but powerful. Patients would never trust a dog to deliver a cancer diagnosis by itself. But here's the opportunity. Now, the opportunity is patients love the idea of something non-invasive, without needles, without radiation, without claustrophobia-inducing scans. Just breathing. That's all I had to do. So instead of reacting defensively, this company explored the opportunity. They built a machine that mimicked what the dog was doing. Patients breathed into a tube. The machine analyzed the biomarkers in the breath. The result wasn't a hedge, it was growth, a new diagnostic product, successful product. Cancer sniffing dogs never became the threat everyone feared, but the opportunity that they revealed was very real. And that's the point. Smart companies don't lose because they miss trends. They lose because they skip the insight stage. They contract when they should be interpreting. They see threats where customers experience unmet needs. They react when they should be reframing. The strategic edge today isn't reacting faster to trends. It's having a disciplined way to turn trends into insight before your competitors do. That pause is where smart strategy lives. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our chief idea guy, Brian Matamore.
Hey, thank you, Tom. I have a build on what you were saying. A couple months ago, I did a session for Weight Watchers. And of course, if you want to be threatened by something, the GLP-1s, right? No. Part of the session was how do we build this into our programs more successfully using GLP-1s? And if you've noticed the press, they have done that. And it's a brilliant, I want to call it pivot, but it's treating that friction as an opportunity to what you're talking about, Tom. All right, so today I want to talk about, I just got back from a destination wedding in Ireland. I wasn't watching the news, and we're supposed to be on talking about something timely, and I'm thinking I got nothing. I couldn't think of anything. And so, what do you do when you got nothing? You look for other arenas, you read, and do all that kind of stuff, right? So one thought I had was, well, maybe I could tie it into a national day. As you probably know, Chase's calendar of events, they'll list 5 or 6 national days for each day of the year, right? And so yesterday, for instance, was National Public Domain Day, right? So this champions all the things that are now part of the public domain. So if you want to write a vampire story with Betty Boop, Nancy Drew, Winnie the Pooh, or Pluto, you can now do that because those are part of the public domain, right? Tomorrow is National Kid Inventors Day. It's like, damn, I wish I'd gotten that one. But no, I didn't get that. So you know what today is? You won't believe it. I almost fell over when I read it. It's National Nothing Day. It really is. National Nothing Day was established in 1972 by a journalist, right? And it's now part of the Chase's thing. And his recommendation is you do nothing today. All right. So nothing. How the heck do you make a segment out of that? And it could, black holes, dark matter, a Seinfeld episode, I'm getting nowhere. So I flipped it, which you can do in ideation work and do the opposite. So I came up with 5 something days, right? And so here they are, and they're all based on ideation processes and creative principles. So the first one, it's really important in the ideation world and creative world and innovation world to think impossible thoughts, because you think those impossible thoughts and then you try to make them real. So I thought, well, today could be National Wish Day. You wish for the impossible and then try to make it real. By the way, you tend to wish rationally. These are things that can be done. To make this really work, you want to wish for things that can't be done, that violate laws of nature or physics, and then bring it back to reality. And then I also thought, well, who could be a sponsor for this? Okay. And, certainly Disney might be a really good sponsor for this, right? Or the Wish Foundation with Disney. All right, opportunity number 2. In ideation and creativity work, you want to do building, right? It's all about building on people's ideas. So how do we model that behavior? And so this is now National Yes and Day. And if you know improvisation, right, it's all about yes and. You don't denigrate what the person said, yes and then you build on it, right? So it's all about the building, right? And so who could be a sponsor for this? The one I thought might be good might be Miro. That's an online brainstorming platform because it's all about the building. Okay, day number 3, right? Part of this ideation process, and Tom began to allude to it, you want to look at root causes, systems thinking, Musk might say first principles, et cetera, et cetera. You have to frame correctly what you're going to work on. And so I call this National Why Day. or really it should be National Why Day, 5 whys. Why 5 whys? Well, because Toyota, as you probably know, pioneered this process in their manufacturing, right? So, if the robot's not working, your first why'd the robot stop? Because the fuse blew. Why did the fuse blow? Because the circuit overloaded. Why did the circuit overload? Because the bearings weren't lubricated. Why weren't the bearings lubricated? Because the lubrication pump wasn't circulating enough oil. The fifth why wasn't the pump circulating oil? Because the pump intake was clogged with metal shavings. Okay, so that's getting back to root causes. That's National Why Day. All right, number 4, the fourth day. In this world of creativity, you want to bring in associations from other worlds, right? And I thought a really fun way to do this, and you might even do this with the kids, would be in your conversation, you say, now that reminds me of, right? And as soon as you do that, and by the way, if you're in a meeting and you're thinking of thought, this is reminding me of something here, and you might dismiss it, often hidden without that. You might not know immediately, but hidden without that might be the solution to the problem. So it's important not to dismiss those intuitive things. Gosh, I'm thinking about taking out the trash this morning. Relevant. What the heck does that do? It. You might find if you explore that, it holds an answer for you. And so who might be a sponsor of this? I thought, well, maybe Ancestry.com, right? Okay. And the fifth and final one, in the world of creativity and analogy and principle transfer and renaming and repositioning, all that those are critical components of inventing new things. Inventors throughout history, that's their preferred modality, right? Is transferring principles from one thing to another. And I call this, it's like day. So what you do is anytime you say, well, that's like, and then you fill in the blank. So if let's say you run a hospital and you want to get new ideas. So how is it like a hotel? Or how could it be like a hotel? How could it be like a sporting event? How could it be like an amusement park? And you can't help but get new ideas when you bring in these other arenas to talk about other processes, other systems, other arenas to help you get new ideas. Okay, so those are my 5 days. I want to end with a personal, real world example in this world of it's like. So we were working with a large organization, packaged goods. We were their innovation agency. We had what we frankly knew would be a hit in the marketplace because we had done a tremendous amount of qualitative focus group work. We'd also done the quantitative work, and we knew there was a huge opportunity for the idea. The general manager, to his credit, he said, well, let's roll the dice. Let's launch this thing nationally. And we were like, well, yeah, we could do that, but let's optimize this thing in a test market before we launch nationally, just to make sure we got all the components right, and that'll make sure we succeed in an even bigger way. And he was adamant. And I love that about him. He said, no, we're just going to launch it nationally. And I'm trying to think, how the heck can I get him to consider doing a test market? And he was a graduate of the Naval Academy. And so what I came up with, I said to him, this is like D-Day, right? He's like, well, what are you talking about? I said, well, the Allies, they didn't invade Europe. They invaded Normandy. And as soon as I said that, he started laughing. And that convinced him that, yes, we should do a test market around a specific market. Okay, so that's what I had to share to you today. I've transmuted nothing, hopefully, into something. And we'll follow the something up with our OD person, Ginny. Ginny, you're up.
Well, thank you, Brian. So what I'm going to talk about today is AI adoption. And what's happening is that some companies are actually using financial incentives to encourage employees to use AI. So my challenge for everyone is asking this question: is this an effective change management strategy? Incenting people to use AI. So I'm going to take us back 5 months. And I talked about a Korn Ferry survey. It was a survey to 250 board of directors and chief executives. And it was a survey about their readiness for the future. And the findings of that survey started with this: The people running major corporations are quietly admitting something they never admitted before. They don't know if they can handle what's coming. And then if you take this further as it relates to AI, the survey said leaders are panic spending billions with no promise of payoff. So that was 5 months ago. So now we come to January 2026 and see what's going on in this space. So Bloomberg reported that companies are trying bonuses to get workers to use AI. So that's kind of how some of these leaders are handling this. So yes, employers are trying a radically new tactic to get workers to use AI, and this tactic is cash. I mean, some companies are rewarding workers with bonus pools, spot bonuses, points, or even merchandise if they use AI tools at work. And then Bloomberg further reports that concerns about job security, limited time for training, and a reluctance to share successful AI techniques have slowed down the uptake of AI. So as a result, the leaders across sectors are trying to find new ways to encourage, the use. Now, some data that backs this up, and this is per Gallup, 45% of US workers report using AI at least a few times a year. It's 45%, a few times a year. Only 23% use it weekly, and just 10% use it daily. That's very low uptake. When you look at where the adoption is happening, is the highest actually. It's highest in tech, as you would expect, at 50%, finance at 33%, and professional services at 30%. So that's kind of where a lot of this uptake is happening. So who are these companies that are incentivizing AI use? The article talks about French drug maker Sanofi, San Francisco-based fintech Brex Inc., and IBM. And they're among the firms that are paying cash, awarding points, or giving out merchandise to expand adoption of AI. So Sanofi awards points for experimenting with AI, with the underlying philosophy that rewarding people who experiment and share what they learn encourages staff to view AI as an opportunity. Brex awards spot bonuses for AI-driven projects, from small automations to extensive workflow redesigns. Payouts range from $150 for modest improvements to several $1,000s for high-impact initiatives. And IBM is offering merchandise-based incentives and grants, and they call them Blue Points. And winners of its annual AI innovation contest can get these points, and they can redeem electronics, appliances, and even concert tickets. So what's my view on this? Well, I think there's a line between bribery and incentive. And knowing the resistance to AI, I kind of feel like this financial approach is like promising a lollipop to a child if they behave. The child responds to the desirability of the lollipop with really not understanding the goodness of behaving. So this is about rewarding the action and not the outcome. So if leaders genuinely believed in the power of AI, they should impart a thoughtful change management strategy. Financial rewards result in an increase of AI adoption, probably more in the short term, but it's not necessarily going to be a sustainable approach. Leaders need to put the foundational work of explaining to employees the need for change. Explain the business threats of not adopting AI and the business benefits of adopting AI. Start with those foundations. Answering the why change question is critical. Why do I need to change? And in addition to the explanation, describe what the future state looks like in detail. What is different about the AI workplace? than the current workplace. We must remember that the mindset needs to be changed first, then the behavior change will follow. So we've got to focus on that mindset. The slower lack of AI adoption is a classic change challenge. Yes, there will be resistance. Of course, there will be. However, if employees are using AI just to get a payoff, they are being compliant to the change and not committed to the change. They don't necessarily truly believe in the benefit of AI, but what they do believe in is the benefit of more money in their wallets. So only when there is a commitment will there be lasting change. The commitment is the belief that AI will benefit their job and the organization. So I come back to this notion of leaders panic spending on AI and don't understand the payoff. So if this is the case, how can they truly lead the change? How can they convince their organizations to use it? It's a big question. So how should financial incentives be administered? Well, there is a change strategy where the future state is clearly stated and understood by all those impacted. And successful outcomes are rewarded and shared. And then showcasing the ability of AI. So make the reason for change clear and get the people impacted to believe in it, to understand it. They don't understand it and they're just getting paid. You're not really accomplishing anything. So kind of coming back to that, dealing with children, I would hypothesize that the children whose parents rewarded them for cleaning their rooms, I don't think they necessarily grew into adults who naturally maintain tidy habits. So when rewards disappear, the motivation also disappears too. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alan, our supply chain guru.
Well, thank you, Jenny. I'm wondering if I should even say anything or I should just enjoy National Do Nothing Day. I was just thinking of just getting out a little bit of Bobby McFerrin and, don't worry, be happy. Just kind of sit back and play that for everybody. But being a consultant for 40 years, no, I've decided I need to do something that's just riveting for everybody. And that's what I was going to do in December, but instead Santa Claus took over, as you remember. So today I want to talk about the unique nature of Department of Justice Transportation and Logistics for evidence that's used in trials, criminal and civil trials, mostly criminal trials. And so this is a niche in the supply chain, particularly in the logistics world, that's I find very interesting. Having recently wrapped up a project working with the DOJ on this exact same issue, I got this enormous education on the importance of logistics in the transportation of evidence used in trials. So transporting evidence for the Department of Justice there's a framework that's far from standard logistics operations. It's a highly specialized logistics niche where legal compliance, security, and operational precision converge. What I mean by operational precision, I mean this is an Apollo 13 that failure is not an option sort of convergence. Unlike commercial freight, evidence is not just cargo. It's a critical component of the judicial process, and the integrity can, in fact, determine the outcome of a case. This particular session that I want to talk about that I'm in today is about the transportation process and why it's unique and the challenges that are involved. So let's talk about first why evidence transport is different than everything else. Well, first off, it's governed by very, very strict and detailed legal and procedural requirements. Every item, whether it's physical or biological or now even digital, has to remain uncontaminated, authentic, and admissible in court. A single lapse in judgment or a single lapse in handling from material moving from one end of the coast to the other coast or from a different country back into the United States can compromise a case, making the logistics function one of the most sensitive in the justice system. So key differentiators include the legal accountability. So every movement has to be documented. I mean, seriously, every movement, even the driver of the truck or the driver of the whatever vehicle they're moving it in has to identify when they're transporting, when they're not transporting, when they're taking breaks. All of that actually becomes ancillary evidence in the case. And so the accountability has to have documentation, and that documentation has to be provable and has to be unalterable sort of documentation. That's why there's a whole business behind the logistics documentation proof, particularly when it's digital, that's a proof that the software has not been altered as well. Security takes precedence over speed. Unlike commercial logistics, particularly things like Amazon and two-day delivery, speed is a secondary, if at all, even a concern in security and compliance. And then the specialized handling requirements often exist. So climate control, tamper-proof packaging, secure routing, secure background checks of the operators of the vehicles and the trucks, etc. Then there's the chain of custody, which is really kind of the cornerstone of this entire DOJ evidence logistics system. This is actually about the trail showing who handled the evidence when, under what conditions. Every single transfer from collection to courtroom has to be logged with timestamps, handler identification, custody forms, seals on trailers and boxes and things like that. Failure to maintain this chain can render evidence inadmissible, making documentation as critical as the physical security. It is literally as critical. So those who spend a lifetime in, say, the Department of Defense contractor world, they understand that this is very similar to the kinds of traceability and security that's required with documentation in making defense components. Operational challenges include tamper-proof packaging, environmental controls that I mentioned earlier, secure vehicles and routing. So vehicles have to include GPS tracking. And by the way, very, very detailed, almost non-consumer available GPS tracking, secure compartments, and oftentimes armed escorts for high-risk transfers. We did a consulting project many years ago for a fentanyl, a pharmaceutical grade fentanyl manufacturer in Rhode Island. And there were times where they actually had to move all their products via armored cars, armored vehicles. We did some work on logistics years ago for a company that moved nuclear waste. And that nuclear waste had to have overflights. This was class 1 nuclear waste. This was literally coming out of military reactors on ships and things like that. And so as it moved on rail, there was actually helicopter overflights that followed the rail car and did surveillance as it was going along. So secure vehicles and routings exist, and some of those same tools and techniques, including overflights, exist in certain evidence logistics environments. And then to make things more complex, if that's not complex enough, remember, you're moving logistics across different jurisdictions. And so this jurisdictional coordination is really important. So you have cases that span multiple stages or agencies that require seamless coordination as you're moving across the country, across the world, on top of the unbroken custody trail. And then there's a legal and procedural compliance that the logisticians have to be aware of and have to apply. And this includes adherence to all kinds of federal standards and other adjacent agency protocols. There's actually a set of guidelines from the National Institute of Justice and the Forensic FBI Standards Manual that dictate the packaging, the labeling. I mean, very, very specifically, right down to the font size and the font type on the documentation. And again, compliance is not optional. This is, by the way, why it costs 7 times more to move a 3-ring binder of evidence from the East Coast to the West Coast than it costs to move it via FedEx overnight, first morning delivery. So it's very, very expensive to do this. A lot of other technology and risk mitigation techniques are applied on a regular basis. This, by the way, if you think that RFID's first application was in consumer products, it wasn't. RFID and barcoding's first applications were in real-time tracking and automated custody updates in the FBI's logistics systems and the National Institute of Justice logistics systems. By the way, the same thing can be said about blockchain. One of the earliest uses of blockchain technology was from the National Institute of Justice and the FBI. So it turns out that some of these government agencies' demands for this traceability, serialization, and full compliance actually were either developed or at least first experimented by these government agencies. These innovations, of course, strengthen accountability and reduce risks. So a real world example of this, by the way, that I can't fail to share, and this is the lessons from the O.J. Simpson case. Most people remember the O.J. Simpson case. And there was a huge issue that exposed when they exposed the serious flaws in the chain of custody practices and evidence handling by law enforcement. The defense attorneys successfully challenged the reliability of blood samples and other forensic evidence simply based on the chain of control and the chain of the evidence. They also had some other forensic evidence pointing to gaps in documentation and contamination risks. These failures not only weakened the prosecution case, but also became absolutely the textbook example of what not to do in evidence management. And by the way, it didn't just happen at the Los Angeles Police Department. It happened at every level, all the way up to the federal prosecution level. As a result, law enforcement agencies nationwide revamped their protocols, emphasizing meticulous documentation and secure transport to avoid these kind of breakdowns. So this niche is unique simply because we have to have legal defensibility and forensic reliability. It's not just about moving materials. It actually has a bigger purpose, and that is to protect law and order and to protect those elements of our society that depend upon strong evidence in a law and order sort of process. So if I look ahead, the DOJ continues to advance this technology with advanced tracking. Now they're using AI-driven risk analysis and predictive routing to further secure the chain of custody. It might surprise you, but in federal cases, there's every year somewhere between 5 and 15 cases where the evidence disappears en route, and it's a nefarious disappearance. And so considering the hundreds of thousands of transports that they do a year, a few of those, 5 to 15, isn't a big number, but it hurts the rule of law. It hurts our society. So that's why they're looking at now risk analysis and predictive routing to train personnel in how to avoid or how to predict things that possibly could happen. Bottom line, DOJ evidence transportation is a specialized logistics niche defined by security, compliance, and precision. We should all be happy about that because this is what our rule of law and our government and our society depends upon. It's about safeguarding justice using supply chain skills. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Tim for some final words.
Thanks, Alan. Lately, I've been watching my daughter really engage the world around her. She's getting older. She just turned 6, so she's at a really fun age where, she's really acting in accordance with everything for the first time a lot of times, and a lot of times it's really the small things. We went to a science museum the other day and there was an exhibit explaining Bernoulli's principle. Now, she doesn't quite understand the science just yet, but it basically had a vacuum hose that basically just blows air, and it's supposed to push the air out between 2 bowling balls, etc. So all that stuff. But she loved it nonetheless. She loved with taking the vacuum hose and just blowing her hair around and blowing little cards around on the floor and everything else. And we spent probably half an hour focusing just on that activity. And to me, that was incredible moments, right? And it was in that moment I'm sitting with on the ground with her doing this, it hit me. We as adults stop doing those types of things as we get older, not because we think that they're less joyful, but because of either fear or responsibility or what other people might think, all these things. And there's something else, that I noticed about her is that she's excited about new things and a little scared at the same time. So similar to kind of how we are as adults, but that fear doesn't stop her from actually pursuing that as it does with most people. it comes with this excitement along with it, especially when she's not alone. If she has a supporting person like myself or mom or a partner with her, like a friend, in that moment, it can make a big difference about whether they pursue that activity or not. And it's that mix of curiosity, courage, and even presence, I guess, if you will, got me thinking a lot about leadership. Thinking about the last 10 years or so, somewhere along the way, I think I lost a little bit of the fun Tim at work. Now, I don't joke as much. I don't nearly laugh as much, not because I don't want to, but because I'm often in the grinder. I'm focused on day-to-day execution. We're behind schedule or we're in high pressure environments and we're in constant execution mode. And so there seems to be little time and little room for jokes and having a lot of fun at work because it's not always fun and games. I wouldn't say that I'm afraid though. I don't always give myself the time or the grace to explore anymore either. These quick wins that we typically go after to be efficient and effective as adults, they replace a deeper investment in ourselves and our own personal lives. And the responsibility that we feel sometimes can replace joy. And when you're a leader or even a parent, you feel like you always have to be on, plugged in, turned on, ready to go. And that overall weight tends to consistently add up over time. Now, as you move into leadership roles, expectations do change. That's understandable. People expect you to have the right answers or be confident or be more confident in the moment in your answer or your response, or have somewhat of a near certainty or a minimum risk solution before you pursue taking an action. Now, some of that is earned, but sometimes it feels like leadership culture today doesn't tolerate much use of your imagination or additional exploration. And you're always expected to be serious and almost always certain. But what's interesting, I think, is that when I teach or I train leaders, I'm fun. This podcast, I'm a lot of fun. I joke, I engage. So I know that version of me still exists somewhere. But in day-to-day execution environments, I'm quieter. I'm more contained, I'm more executive. Now, both versions work, but only one is consistently rewarded. So I want to I was thinking about this overall concept and I started thinking about stakes, right? So what's the myth of high stakes? So here, I think the idea of stakes that we have in terms of leadership opportunities, I think is where we sometimes get it wrong. We tell ourselves that the higher you go, the higher the stakes are. Now, there's a moment in the Braveheart movie that's always stuck with me. If you ever remember the movie Braveheart, the Scottish nobles are debating whether or not they go to war, and they're hesitant because they have lands, titles, and legacies to lose. And Robert the Bruce gives voice to that fear by saying these men have lands and titles. It's much to risk. And then William Wallace turns back and essentially says, "And the common man who bleeds on the battlefield, does he risk less?" Now, that line cuts straight to the root because it reminds us that everyone has stakes, everyone has risks, everyone has pretty much almost an equal footing for the most part. The frontline engineer, the new hire, the parent just trying to hold it all together. Leadership doesn't create stakes or risks, it just makes them potentially more visible for everyone to see. And when leaders believe that they're the only ones carrying that risk, I think empathy shrinks, imagination begins to tighten, and certainty really turns into kind of a wall or even maybe some armor. And watching my daughter move through the world with this curiosity instead of certainty reminds me that she doesn't yet believe she's the only one carrying that risk or has to deal with it all by herself. And I think that openness is exactly what allows her to keep looking and perusing and exploring the world around her. So if you find yourself living inside this certainty box, here's a way back. First, I think we have to create these small pockets of curiosity. In a meeting, you have to ask yourself, okay, what are we missing in this discussion? Or what am I missing in this situation here? Or what don't we quite understand yet? I think curiosity, we as adults tend to sometimes wait for permission or wait for an opening. Curiosity doesn't need permission, but it does need some protection. So we have to force it along the way. Second, I think we have to let play show up without justification. Not every conversation has to be planned. Not every meeting in person has to be planned. It doesn't need to be optimized. It doesn't always need a metric, I guess, if you will. when it comes down to it. If your team never laughs, they're probably not taking real risks either. So making sure that there's room for people to recognize that optimization isn't necessarily something that always has to happen, that you're willing to go off script, and sometimes you can make that work. Third, I think naming uncertainty out loud. At the end of the year last year, I mentioned that I stood in front of my team at an all hands meeting and I said, look, guys, I've been around quite some time, and this was probably one of the toughest years that I've ever had when it comes to execution. And it was hard. And I recognized and I laid it out to the team. And I think saying those kind of things, saying it's hard or we're still learning, it doesn't weaken the authority or the experience, but it builds trust within the leaders and overall the organization. And one of the other things that I was talking to somebody about is you have to model joy and happiness visibly. A lot of times I was talking to somebody about being a leader in an organization, and that person said, have you ever seen a person at this level happy? And it kind of sucked to me. A lot of people don't look always very happy when they're in these executive leadership roles. But I think if leaders look miserable, people assume leadership is misery. And so that's what I don't want my daughter to see. I want her to see that you can do everything as best you can, and you can still be happy doing it. You have to have the right mindset. You have to reframe a bit. But growing up doesn't mean shutting down and putting things off to the side and in an isolated area. Leadership doesn't necessarily mean losing joy, and that even as adults, especially as leaders, we're still allowed to explore and innovate and inspire those around us. Because leading like you're 5 or leading like you're 6 isn't about being childish and doing childlike things. It's about being curious enough and even open enough to keep moving forward. Okay, with that, I'm going to welcome everyone back to the table. We've got a few minutes here for some closing comments, and then we'll wrap things up here.
Hey, I just want to say one thing about what Jenny said. Oh, and by the way, I love the logistics stuff from Alan. I think there's going to be an episode of Grey's Anatomy that could incorporate biological transfers. Anyway, there was a wonderful book that came out in 1993. It's called Punished by Rewards by Alfie Cohen, and it really talks about how innovation and creativity and new ideas should be internally, intrinsically motivated and not externally rewarded. There's a great quote in the book. It was something like, if you want to kill innovation, reward it. And so I would encourage people to look at that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
very good point.
I love that.
One of the things I was actually going to talk about is in relation to Jenny's and Tom's approach is there's something called Jevons paradox, and this was 1865, I think, something like that. He came up with this idea that as they were starting to use more coal, there was more innovative technologies coming out. The idea was that even though there was more innovation and they were potentially using less coal each individual time, overall in the long run, we were going to be using more of it as a resource in the long run. So to Tom's point about Ozempic and the food situation, even though there's this new tool that potentially allows you to eat less food, Jevons paradox will typically show that even with cars and hybrids and new tools that allow you to do less in one sitting, over the course of time, you typically will engage and absorb more of that resource in the long run. So it's actually really interesting and aligned. The same goes with AI, leadership, change, all these things. And so we're finding more efficiencies, but at the same time, the resources are going to continue to be desired as part of that resource. So it's very interesting. Take a look at it. Jevons paradox, quite interesting.
You know, there's this is such a wonderful program for us. I know, I hope our participants and our listeners enjoy it as much as we do, because I think we all learn from each other some
Yes.
things. I've learned something from every one of you here. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them. First one is, it's so cute when Brian says, I couldn't come up with anything. I had nothing. Like, come on, Brian, really? And then what you did is you made a whole presentation about nothing, which I thought was kind of brilliant.
Something.
Yeah, but then something, Tim, that you said that really strikes me, and that is that everyone has stakes and risks. And to me, that is such an important insight, because that is a very important key to good leadership. Those exact words were given to me by a college professor in a class I took on negotiating strategy.
Okay.
And he said, look, if you're going to negotiate anything, understand everyone has, these exact words were, stakes and risks. And he who wins the negotiation or gets the best outcome is the one who really understood the stakes and risks of everyone else.
That's
And I
right.
thought, and I think, Jenny, that is one of the important keys to change management, having the empathy and understanding the stakes and the risks of all the people. In other words,
Right.
the human understanding human nature,
Yes.
right? And
Yes.
and so without that, if
Yeah.
one doesn't care about the people on the other side of the table or the people whose jobs you're going to change, understanding their stakes and risks, it's hard to affect change.
Yeah.
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 So thank you, Tim, for that. That was just such wonderful insight. I'm glad we had an opportunity to share that with our listeners.
And the two things that hit me so hard from Tim's talk were how many times you see a happy manager, number
Yes.
one,
Yeah,
they're,
yeah.
they're usually scowling. And then, secondly, I loved his notion that curiosity needs protection. And I think that's a profound thought as well. So
Yeah,
thank you for
very
both of those,
profound.
Tim.
Well, Brian, to that, unhappy managers, and let's go back to Seinfeld because it is nothing day. When George Costanza said, "If you look miserable, people are going to think you're really working hard."
Yeah,
Right,
that point that the hottest coach in the country right now is Indiana's football coach Signetti.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And somebody criticized him the other day and said it was a player that had actually left the program
Yeah.
and said he's never happy, he's never satisfied. And an interviewer asked him about that, and he just basically said, "Yeah, that's part of my secret of success. Is to never be
should
happy,
drive.
never
Yeah,
be
yeah.
I got to be thinking ahead. I got to be thinking 3 steps ahead, and I'm not going to be caught up in all of that." So I thought that was an interesting juxtaposition. I'd like to see leaders show more joy as well. But
Yeah,
that's
and
Yeah.
Tim,
hard to do
going
that.
back to your 6-year-old daughter, it's how do we show up when we get home?
Right.
Not as a manager, not only how do we show up for the people who work for us, but how are we coming home?
That's
And
right.
are we coming home miserable?
Yeah.
Right.
And if we are, what kind of message is that telling our families about what we do for a living? And the other part that reminded me of from a feedback standpoint, someone had said, well, if you really want to know how your team thinks about you, ask how they talk about you at their dinner table.
That's right.
That's right.
What are they saying about you when you're not in the room or when you're on holiday, right? All
Yeah.
those things.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Well,
Just one last thing. So, Jenny, your comment about there's a line between bribery and incentive. First off, that makes me start to think about some of my decisions in the past. But I actually have a client right now where they're offering bribery. It's not for AI use, but it's for something else. And one of the things that when the employees view it as bribery and not as incentive, I think one of the consequences, and I've seen it here, is a loss of management credibility.
Yeah.
They look
Yeah.
at management and they go, "Well, that's really hokey. You really think that the pizza lunch
Yes.
is you
Right.
really think that's going to shape our behaviors
right.
and that's going to change anything around here?" And it's more than words because the credibility just lost a couple notches. And at some point in time, when credibility hits rock bottom, trust disappears as well. And when
Yeah.
trust disappears, how is it? You can't do anything. You
Yeah.
can't lead if people just don't trust you. You just can't.
Absolutely.
You lose the foundation, then everything is gone.
Didn't you know
Yeah.
that pizza, parties are the answer to everything?
Oh,
Ping
yeah.
pong tables too.
Yeah. Some of the hokiness and stuff, man. It's like, do you literally look at yourself but my father used to say in his company, he said, "You go through the factory, do not disrespect those people working on the machines. In the head of every machine operator is an engineer.
That's right.
And these are the ones who see the
Yeah.
dumb designs before customers do."
Yeah.
And so this it's in a sense it's almost disrespectful, the pizza
Mhm.
party and the ping pong table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, friends, that's a wrap on our first
Yeah.
Curious and Quirky episode of the year, which means if listening was one of your resolutions, congratulations. You're already outperforming 87% of the population. Now, if today sparked a new idea, maybe challenged an old habit, or even made you say, "I should probably write that down," then this episode is already doing more work than your gym membership. Now, remember, resolutions are just plans with good intentions. Pivots are resolutions that learn something, and I'll start Monday is a legally recognized January phrase. So stretch those mental muscles, hydrate your brain, and don't worry if sometime you're still stuck in the PTO mode. Innovation is a marathon, not a January sprint. So stay curious, stay quirky, and if you're still listening in February, we're not saying you're winning, but the leaderboard is looking good. All right, friends, we'll see you next month.
Thank you. Bye
Thank
now.
you. Bye-bye.